Anarchism is often defined as a political philosophy which holds the state to be undesirable, unnecessary, or harmful. I argue that while anti-statism is central, it is inadequate to define anarchism solely on this basis. Instead that anarchism entails opposing authority or hierarchical organization in the conduct of human relations, including, limited to, the system. Anarchism. Anarchists advocate stateless societies based on non-hierarchical free associations. Anti-dogmatic philosophy. Anarchism draws on many currents of thought and strategy. Not offer a fixed body of doctrine from a single particular worldview, influxing and flowing as a philosophy. And traditions of anarchism, none of which are mutually exclusive. Of thought can differ fundamentally, seeing anything from extreme individualism to complete collectivism. Anarchism have often been divided into the categories of social and individualist anarchism or similar dual classifications. Often considered a radical left-wing ideology, and anarchist economics and anarchist legal philosophy reflect anti-authoritarian interpretations of communism, Egoism, Syndicalism, Mutualism, or participatory economics. As social movement has regularly endured fluctuations in popularity. The of anarchism as a social movement has been represented by Anarcho-Communism and Anarcho-Syndicalism. Individualist anarchism being primarily a literary phenomenon which nevertheless did have an impact on the bigger currents, and individualists have also participated in large anarchist organizations. Oppose all forms of aggression, seeing self-defense or nonviolence, and pacifism. Warriors have supported the use of some coercive measures, including violent revolution and propaganda of the deed. Path to an anarchist society. Is a compound word composed from the word anarchy and the suffix, thus derived respectively from the Greek anarchy, one without rulers. The term adopted by Maximilien de Robespierre to attack those on the left whom he had used for his own ends during the French Revolution but was determined to get rid of. Though these anarchists there were few who exhibited the social revolt characteristics of later anarchists. Revolutionaries of the early 19th century who contributed to the anarchist doctrines of the next generation, William Godwin and Wilhelm Weitling, did not use the word anarchist or anarchism in describing themselves or their beliefs. Proudhon was the first political philosopher to call himself an anarchist. Formal birth of anarchism the mid-19th century. 90s from France. Libertarianism has often been used as a synonym for anarchism and was used almost exclusively in this sense until the 1950s in the United States. As a synonym is still common outside the United States. Use. Refer to individualistic free market philosophy only. To free market anarchism as libertarian anarchism. These themes can be found in the 6th century BC. Works of Taoist philosopher Lao Tzu, and later centuries by Zhuangzi and Bao Jinjian. Sufi has been described by various sources as anarchist. A thief is put in jail. Becomes a ruler of a nation. Sinope and the Cynics, contemporary Zeno of Citium, the of Stoicism, introduced similar topics. Chimes considered the first anarchist in the Christian anarchist tradition. He wrote that the true founder of anarchy was Jesus Christ and that anarchist society was that of the apostles. Reverberates subversive religious conceptions like the aforementioned seemingly anarchistic Taoist teachings and that of other anti-authoritarian religious traditions, creating a complex relationship regarding the question as to whether or not anarchism and religion are compatible. Died when the state is viewed as a form of sinful idolatry. The France's political philosopher Étienne de la Boétie has been said to write an important anarchist precedent in his most famous work, The Discourse on Voluntary Servitude. The Protestant Christian Gerard Winstanley and his group the Diggers are cited by various authors as proposing anarchist social measures in the 17th century in England. That first entered the English language in 1642, during English Civil War, as a form of abuse by Royalists against their Roundhead opponents. By French Revolution some, see enrages, but use the term positively, in addition to Jacobin centralization of power, revolutionary government as oxymoronic. By the 19th century, the word anarchism had lost its initial negative connotation. Sprang from the secular or religious thought of the Enlightenment, particularly Jean-Jacques Rousseau's arguments for the moral centrality of freedom. Of anarchist currents during the French Revolution, with revolutionaries using the term anarchist in a positive light as early as September 1793. They used revolutionary government as a contradiction in terms. Jacobin dictatorship. Arlott wrote in 1794 that government and revolution are incompatible, and the people wishes to set its constituted authorities in permanent insurrection against itself. Revolution. Miracle. Manifesto of the Equals. Scene 96. The communal enjoyment of the fruits of the earth and looked forward to the disappearance of the revolting distinction of rich and poor, and small, others and valets, others and governed. William Godwin developed what many consider the first expression of thought. To Peter Kropotkin, to formulate the political and economical conceptions of anarchism. He did not give that name to the ideas developed in his work. Godwin attached his anarchist ideas to an early Edmund Burke. Benstead credits Josiah Warren, who promoted stateless and voluntary communities where all goods and services were private, when the first man to expound and formulate the doctrine now known as anarchism. The describe himself as an anarchist was Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, a philosopher and politician, with some to call him the founder of modern anarchist theory. The unist Joseph de Jacques was the first person to describe himself as libertarian. Argued that it's the product of his or her labor that the worker has a right to satisfaction of his or her needs, or may be their nature. In Germany, the post-Hegelian philosopher Max Stirner published the book The Ego and Its Own, which will later be considered an influential early text of individualist anarchism. And in the 1848 revolution in France, included Anselme Belli-Garrigue, Coeur d'Iroy, Joseph de Jacques and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. International and the Paris Commune. In reaction followed the revolutions of 1848. 10 countries had experienced brief or long-term social upheaval as groups carried out nationalist uprisings. These attempts at systematic change ended in failure. Negative elements took advantage of the divided groups of socialists, liberals, and anarchists, and further revolt. For the International Workingmen's Association, sometimes called the First International, diverse revolutionary currents including French followers of Proudhon, Blists, Delphs, trade unionists, Socialists and Social Democrats. To active workers' movements, the National became a significant organization. Became a leading figure in the International and a member of its General Council. Socialists opposed Marx's state socialism, adding political abstentionism and small property holdings. 88. Following their unsuccessful participation in the League of Peace and Freedom, revolutionary Mikhail Bakunin and his collectivist anarchist associates joined the First International, decided not to get involved with the LPF. With the Federalist Socialist sections of the International, advocated the revolutionary overthrow of the state and the collectivization of property. The activists worked with the Marxists to push the First International in a more revolutionary socialist direction. The National became polarized into two camps, Wicks and Bakunin as their respective figureheads. popularized Marx's ideas as centralist and predicted that, if the Socialist Party came to power, leaders would simply take the place of the ruling class they had fought against. And George Woodcock reports that the annual Congress of the International had not taken place in 1870 owing to the outbreak of the Paris Commune. In 1871 the General Council called only a special conference in London. Able to attend from Spain and none from Italy. Technical excuse that split away from the Federation Romanda to avoid inviting Bakunin's Swiss supporters. The minority of anarchists was present, and General Council's resolutions passed almost unanimously, clearly directed against Bakunin and his followers. In 1882, conflict climaxed with a final split between the two groups at the Hague Congress. Bakunin and James Guillaume were expelled from the International and its headquarters were transferred to New York. The Federalist sections formed their own international at the St. Imre Congress, a revolutionary anarchist program. Was a government that briefly ruled Paris from March 18, formally March 28, 1871. The result of an uprising in Paris after France was defeated in the Franco-Prussian War. Participated actively in the establishment of the Paris Commune. The brothers, Jean Varlin, the murdered in the repression afterwards. Initiated by the Commune, the reopening of workplaces as cooperatives. Anarchists can see their ideas of associated labor beginning to be realized. Commune's ideas on federation obviously reflected the influence of Proudhon on French radical ideas. The Commune's vision of a communal France based on a federation of delegates bound by imperative mandates issued by their electors and subject to recall at any moment echoes Bakunin's and Proudhon's ideas. Bakunin had in favor of the implementation of the binding mandate in 1848, iteration of communes. Ethically and politically the Paris Commune was heavily influenced by anarchist ideas. Which manifests that a notable contribution to the activities of the Commune and particularly to the organization of public services was made by members of various anarchist factions, including the Mutualists Courbet, Let, and Earl, Libertarian collectivists Varlin, Brain Gaius, Bakuninists Elie and Elie Reclus and Louise Michel. Labor. The Aryan sections of the First International were the precursors of the anarcho-syndicalists, to replace the privilege and authority of the state with the free and spontaneous organization of labor. In X, the fusion of organized trades and labor unions, FELU, of United States and Canada unanimously set May 1, 1886, date by which the 8-hour workday would become standard. Across the United States prepared a general strike in support of the event. On Chicago, broke out when strike breakers attempted to cross the picket line. Workers died when police opened fire upon the crowd. The 4th staged a rally at Chicago's Haymarket Square. Owned by an unknown party near the conclusion of the rally. Officer in panic opened fire on the crowd and each other. Officers and at least 4 workers were killed. Directly and indirectly related to the organizers of the rally were arrested and charged with the murder of the deceased officer. The national political celebrities among the labor movement were executed and a 5th committed suicide prior to his own execution. The known as the Haymarket Affair, a setback for the labor movement and the struggle for the 8-hour day. In a second attempt, Time International in scope, organized for the 8-hour day was made. They had the secondary purpose of memorializing workers killed as a result of the Haymarket Affair. Only been conceived as a once-off event. Following year the celebration of International Workers' Day on May Day had become firmly established as an international workers' holiday. 7. International Anarchist Congress of Amsterdam gathered delegates from 14 different countries, Important figures of the anarchist movement: Enrico Malatesta, Pitt, Lefebvre, Bouchou, Eldman, Rocker, and Jean Cornelissen. Treated during the Congress. Particular concerning the organization of the anarchist movement. Per education issues. The strike or anti-militarism. As concerned the relation between anarchism and syndicalism, or unionism. Monet were in particular disagreement themselves on this issue. Ether thought that syndicalism was revolutionary and would create the conditions of a social revolution, while Testa did not consider syndicalism by itself sufficient. The union movement was reformist and even conservative, as essentially bourgeois and anti-worker the phenomenon of professional union officials. That the syndicalists' aims were in perpetuating syndicalism itself. Anarchists must always have anarchy as their end and consequently refrain from committing to any particular method of achieving it. This federation in 1881 was the first major anarcho-syndicalist movement, and trade union federations were of special importance in Spain. The was the Confederación Nacional del Trabajo, Confederation of Labor, ended in 1910. In the 1940s, the T was the major force in Spanish working-class politics, attracting 1.58 million members at one point and playing a major role in the Spanish Civil War. Affiliated with the International Workers' Association, a nation of anarcho-syndicalist trade unions founded in 1922, with gates representing 2 million workers from 15 countries in Europe and Latin America. In particular, the anarchists quickly became active in organizing craft and industrial workers throughout South and Central America. In the early 1920s, most of the trade unions in Mexico, Argentina were anarcho-syndicalist in general outlook. The siege of the Spanish CNT as a revolution was undoubtedly to a great extent responsible for this situation. The most militant of these organizations was the Federación Obrera Regional Argentina, quickly to a membership of nearly 250,000, dwarfed the rival social democratic unions. Prenda of the deed and illegalism. Johann Most added publicizing violent acts of retaliation against counter-revolutionaries because we preach not only action in and for itself, but action as propaganda. Inside and outside the anarchist movement began to use the slogan, Prenda of the deed, to refer to individual bombings, raids, and asides. From 2005 onwards, Russian counterparts of these anti-syndicalist anarchist communists become partisans of economic terrorism and illegal expropriations. A practice emerged, and within it the acts of the anarchist bombers and assassins, propaganda by the deed, anarchist burglars, illegal reappropriation, their desperation and their personal rejection of an intolerable society. They are meant to be exemplary invitations to revolt. Frang was the most famous group to embrace illegalism. And as 1887, important figures in the anarchist movement distanced themselves from such individual acts, and thus wrote that year in Le Revolt that a structure based on centuries of history cannot be destroyed with a few kilos of dynamite. Anarchists advocated the abandonment of these sorts of tactics in favor of collective revolutionary action, through the trade union movement. Syndicalist, Fond Pelloutier, in 1895 for renewed anarchist involvement in the labor movement on the basis that anarchism could do very well without the individual dynamiter. In the infamous 1894 French Lois Solerates, anarchist and labor movements following the few successful bombings and assassinations may have contributed to the abandonment of these kinds of tactics. Reciprocally, state repression, first place, played a role in these isolated acts. The French socialist movement, many groups, and the suppression of the 1871 Paris Commune, the execution and exile of many communards to penal colonies, individualist political expression and acts. State were assassinated between 1881 and 1914 by members of the anarchist movement. President McKinley's assassin Leon Czolgosz claimed to have been influenced by anarchist and feminist Emma Goldman. Associated in the media with anarchists because international terrorism arose during this time period with the widespread distribution of dynamite. To this day, Pride was abandoned by the vast majority of the anarchist movement after World War I and the 1917 October Revolution. Revolution and other uprisings of the 1910s. Participated alongside the Bolsheviks in both February and October revolutions. Initially enthusiastic about the Bolshevik Revolution. A political falling out with the Bolsheviks by the anarchists and other left-wing opposition. Conflict culminated in the 1921 Kronstadt Rebellion. Wu government repressed. Central Russia were either imprisoned, underground or joined the victorious Bolsheviks. Anarchists from Petrograd and Moscow fled to the Ukraine. In territory, they in the civil war against the Whites, of monarchists and other opponents of the October Revolution, and Bolsheviks as part of the Revolutionary Insurrectionary Army of Ukraine led by Nestor Makhno, established an anarchist society in the region for a number of months. Anarchists Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman were amongst those agitating in response to Bolshevik policy and the suppression of the Kronstadt uprising. But left Russia. Of their experiences in Russia, criticizing the amount of control the Bolsheviks exercised. Predictions about the consequences of Marxist rule that the rulers of the new socialist Marxist state would become a new elite had proved all too true. The Bolsheviks in the October Revolution and the resulting Russian Civil War did serious damage to anarchist movements internationally. Activists saw Bolshevik success as setting an example. Communist parties grew at the expense of anarchism and other socialist movements. The United States, example, of the major syndicalist movements of the CGT and IWW left the organizations and joined the Communist International. The wave of 1917 to 1923 saw the active participation of anarchists in varying degrees of protagonism. In rising known as the German Revolution of 1918 and 1919, which established the Bavarian Soviet Republic, the anarchists Gustav Landauer, Geisel and Erich Mussum had important leadership positions within the revolutionary councilist structures. Events known as the Biennio Rosso, the anarcho-syndicalist trade union Union Sindacale Italiana grew to 800,000 members, and the influence of the Italian Anarchist Union, 2,000 members plus Umanità Nova, Italy paper, accordingly. At first to suggest occupying workplaces. In Revolution, the Mexican Liberal Party was established, and during the early 1910s it led a series of military offensives leading to the conquest and occupation of certain towns and districts in Baja California with the leadership of anarcho-communist Ricardo Flores Magón. The Lo Truda group of Russian anarchist exiles looted Nestor Makhno, that anarchists needed to develop new forms of organization in response to the structures of Bolshevism. 36 Manifesto, co-organizational platform of the General Union of Anarchists, was supported. Clubs active today include the Workers' Solidarity Movement in Ireland and the North Eastern Federation of Anarchist Communists of North America. Anarchism emerged as an organizational alternative to platformism that tries to join anarchists of different tendencies under the principles of anarchism without adjectives. In this form found as its main proponents Volin and Sebastian Faure. Behind the anarchist federations grouped around the contemporary Global International of Anarchist Federations. With European fascist regimes. In the 1930s, of fascism in Europe transformed anarchism's conflict with the state. First struggles between anarchists and fascists. Anarchists played a key role in the anti-fascist organization Arditi del Popolo, was strongest in areas with anarchist traditions, achieved some success in their activism, repelling black shirts in the anarchist stronghold of Parma in August 1922. In Anarchist, Lou Fabry, with the first critical theorists of fascism, dubbing it as the preventive counter-revolution. In where right leagues came close to insurrection in the February 1934 riots, Anarchists divided over a united front policy. France and Italy were active in the resistance during World War II. Anarchist Eric Mussum was arrested on charges unknown in the early morning hours of February 28, 1933, few hours after the Reichstag fire in Berlin. The propaganda minister, him as one of those Jewish subversives. 17 months. He imprisoned in the concentration camps at Sonnenberg, Berg and finally, Ornberg. On 2nd, 1934, was transferred to the concentration camp at Oranienburg when finally on the night of July 9, 1934, was tortured and murdered by the guards, his corpse found hanging in a latrine the next morning. Revolution. In National Anarcho-Syndicalist Trade Union Confederación Nacional del Trabajo initially refused to join a Popular Front electoral alliance, and tension by CNT supporters led to a right-wing election victory. 36. The CNT changed its policy and anarchist votes helped bring the Popular Front back to power. The ruling class responded with an attempted coup causing the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939. The Army Rebellion, an anarchist-inspired movement of peasants and workers, led by armed militias, control of Barcelona and of large areas of rural Spain where they collectivized the land. But fascist victory in 1939, anarchists were losing ground in a bitter struggle with the Stalinists, controlled the distribution of military aid to the Republican cause from the Soviet Union. The Spanish Revolution was a workers' social revolution that began during the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War in 1936 and resulted in the widespread implementation of anarchist and more broadly libertarian socialist organizational principles throughout various portions of the country for 2 to 3 years, particularly Catalonia, Asia, and of the Levant. Autonomy was put under worker control. In anarchist strongholds like Catalonia, there was as high as 75%, but in areas with heavy Communist Party of Spain influence, the Soviet Allied Party actively resisted attempts at collectivization enactment. Run through worker committees, Libertarian areas became collectivized and run as Libertarian communes. And Sam Dolgoff estimated that about 8 million people participated directly or at least indirectly in the Spanish Revolution, claimed came closer to realizing the ideal of the free stateless society on a vast scale than any other revolution in history. Troops suppressed the collectives and persecuted both dissident Marxists and anarchists. Italian anarchist Camillo Berneri, volunteered to fight against Franco, was killed instead in Spain by gunmen associated with the Spanish Communist Party. 4 years. And to reorganize itself after the war. The Marxist Federation was established in 1945 after the Anarchist Federation of the Center united with the Anarchist Federation of the Federal District. In the 1940s, Anti-Fascist International Solidarity and the Federation of Anarchist Groups of Cuba merged into the large national organization Asociación Libertaria de Cuba, Libertarian Association. 44 to 1947, the Hungarian Anarchist Communist Federation re-emerged as part of a factory and workplace committee movement, oppressed by the new communist regime. In 1985 in France the Fédération Anarchiste was established and the also synthesized Federazione Anarchica Italiana was founded in Italy. Anarchists formed the League of Free Social Constructors in September 1945 and in 1946 the Japanese Anarchist Federation was founded. Anarchist Congress with delegates from across Europe was held in Paris in May 1948. 2. in the Freie Arbeiterstimme detailing the plight of German anarchists and called for Americans to support them. 1946. The giving of aid parcels to anarchists in Germany was a large-scale operation. The Libertarian Socialists was founded in Germany in 1947 and Rudolf Rocker wrote for its organ, Freie Gesellschaft, which lived until 1953. 1956 the Uruguayan Anarchist Federation was founded. In 1955 the Anarcho-Communist Federation of Argentina renamed itself as the Argentine Libertarian Federation. The debate between synthesis anarchism and platformism took importance once again, especially in the anarchist movements of Italy and France. The Workers' Federation was a syndicalist group inactive in post-war Britain, a Solidarity Federation's earliest predecessors. In 1950 by members of the dissolved Anarchist Federation of Britain. UNB was influenced by anarcho-syndicalist ideas but ultimately not syndicalist itself. WF decided to pursue a more definitely syndicalist-centered strategy from the outset, and to influence important literary and intellectual personalities of the time, Albert Camus, Reed, Goodman, Donald, Ginsberg, Woodcock, Goldkoer, Becla and the French Surrealist group led by André Breton, now openly embraced anarchism and collaborated in the Federation Anarchist. Anarchism became influential in the anti-nuclear movement and anti-war movements of the time, as can be seen in the activism and writings of the English anarchist member of Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament Alex Comfort, or the similar activism of the American Catholic anarcho-pacifists Ammon Hennessy and Dorothy Day. Anarchism became a basis for a critique of militarism on both sides of the Cold War. Anarchist ideas during this period is well documented in Robert Graham's Anarchism, a documentary history of libertarian ideas. Vol. 2. The Essence of the New Anarchism. Contemporary Anarchism. A larger interest in anarchism occurred in Western nations during the 1960s and 1970s. Influential in the counterculture of the 1960s, and anarchists actively participated in the late 60s students' and workers' revolts. In 1998 in Carrara, the International of Anarchist Federations was founded during an international anarchist conference held there in 1968 by the three existing European federations of France, Federation Anarchist, the Federazione Anarchica Italiana of Italy, and the Iberian Anarchist Federation, as well as the Bulgarian Federation in French exile. In the 1970s this was associated with the punk rock movement, amplified by bands such as Crass and the Sex Pistols. The employment crisis in most of Western Europe led to the formation of communes and squatter movements like that of Barcelona. Squatters occupied a disused military base and declared the Freetown Christiania, an anonymous haven in central Copenhagen. Of anarchism in the mid-20th century, of new movements and schools of thought emerged. Tendencies have always been a part of the anarchist movement in the form of anarcho-feminism. They gained with vigor during the second wave of feminism in the 1960s. The rights movement and the movement against the war in Vietnam also contributed to the revival of North American anarchism. Anarchism of the late 20th century drew much of its strength from the labor movement, and have incorporated animal rights activism. Anthropologist David Graeber and anarchist historian Andrei Grubasic have posited a rupture between generations of anarchism, who often still have not shaken the sectarian habits of the 19th century, contrasted with the younger activists who are much more informed. Other elements, indigenous, logical and cultural critical ideas, at the turn of the 21st century formed by far the majority of anarchists. Of the 21st century, anarchism grew in popularity and influence as part of the anti-war, capitalist, deglobalization movements. Known for their involvement in protests against the meetings of the World Trade Organization, WTO, and World Economic Forum. Factions at these protests engaged in rioting, destruction, and confrontations with police. precipitated by ad hoc cadres known as black blocs. Organizational tactics pioneered in this time include security culture groups and the use of decentralized technologies such as the Internet. A event of this period was the confrontations at WDO conference in Seattle in 1999. Anarchist scholar Simon Critchley. Contemporary anarchism can be seen as a powerful critique of the pseudo-libertarianism of contemporary neoliberalism. Contemporary anarchism is about responsibility, intellectual, ethical or socio-economic, flows from an experience of conscience about the manifold ways in which the West ravages the rest, ethical outrage at the yawning inequality, impoverishment and disenfranchisement that is so palpable locally and globally. Anarchist federations in existence include the International of Anarchist Federations, the National Workers' Association, and National Libertarian Solidarity. Organized anarchist movement today is in Spain, in of the Confederación General del Trabajo, CNT. Membership was estimated at around 100,000 for 2003. Syndicalist movements include in Sweden the Central Organization of the Workers of Sweden and the Swedish Anarcho-Syndicalist Youth Federation, UNT8 in France, Union Sindacale Italiana in Italy, US Workers' Solidarity Alliance and the UK Solidarity Federation. The Industrial Unionist Industrial Workers of the World, 2,000 paying members, International Workers' Association, a co-syndicalist successor to the First International, all remain active. Schools of thought. Schools of thought had been generally grouped in two main historical traditions, individualist anarchism and social anarchism, with some different origins and evolution. The first wing of anarchism emphasizes negative liberty, opposition to state or social control over the individual. Those in the social wing emphasize positive liberty to achieve one's potential and argue that humans have needs that society ought to fulfill. Rising equality of entitlement. Ethical and theoretical sense. They're classical, those created throughout the 19th century, and post-classical anarchist schools, those created since the mid-20th century and after. Factions of anarchist thought is philosophical anarchism, which embodies the theoretical stance that the state lacks moral legitimacy without accepting the imperative of revolution to eliminate it. Especially of individualist anarchism, philosophical anarchism may accept the existence of a minimal state as unfortunate, usually temporary, necessary evil, but argue that citizens do not have a moral obligation to obey the state when its laws conflict with individual autonomy. Against sectarianism within the anarchist milieu was anarchism without adjectives, a for toleration first adopted by Fernando Terrada del Marmol in 1889 in response to the bitter debates of anarchist theory at the time. Indefinite anarchisms, collectivist, communist, mutualist, individualist anarchism, is to emphasize the anti-authoritarian beliefs common to all anarchist schools of thought. Point 1. Mutualism. In 18th century English and French labor movements before taking an anarchist form associated with Pierre-Joseph Proudhon in France and others in the United States. Spontaneous order. Organization emerges without central authority. Positive anarchy, where order arises when everybody does what he wishes and only what he wishes, and where business transactions alone produce the social order. It recognized that Proudhon distinguished between ideal political possibilities and practical governance. In contrast to some of his theoretical statements concerning ultimate spontaneous self-governance, Proudhon was heavily involved in French parliamentary politics and allied himself not with anarchist but socialist factions of workers' movements and into advocating state-protected charters for worker-owned cooperatives. Certain nationalization schemes during his life of public service. Anarchism is concerned with reciprocity, association, voluntary contract, credit and currency reform. American mutualist William Batchelder Greene. Worker in the mutualist system would receive just and exact pay for his work. equivalent in cost being exchangeable for services equivalent in cost, profit or discount. Been retrospectively characterized as ideologically situated between individualist and collectivist forms of anarchism. Characterized his goal as a third form of society, synthesis of communism and property. Point 2. Mutualist anarchism. Anarchism refers to several traditions of thought within the anarchist movement that emphasize the individual and their will over any kinds of external determinants such as groups, society, logical systems. Anarchism is not a single philosophy but refers to a group of individualistic philosophies that sometimes are in conflict. NT3. Godwin, often been cited as the first anarchist. Political justice. Consider the first expression of anarchism. A philosophical anarchist. Rationalist and utilitarian basis opposed revolutionary action and saw a minimal state as a present necessary evil that would become increasingly irrelevant and powerless by the gradual spread of knowledge. Good individualism. That all cooperation in labor be eliminated on the premise that this would be most conducive with the general good. A form of individualist anarchism. Egoism. Egoist anarchism. Was founded by one of the earliest and best-known proponents of individualist anarchism, Max Stirner. Ego in its own. In 1844. Ending text of the philosophy. Honor. The limitation on the rights of the individual is their power to obtain what they desire. Regard for God. Morality. Were spooks in the mind. And that society does not exist but the individuals are its reality. Did self-assertion and foresaw unions of egoists. Systematic associations continually renewed by all parties support through an act of will. Winner proposed as a form of organization in place of the state. Eists argue that egoism will foster genuine and spontaneous union between individuals. Inspired many interpretations of Stirner's philosophy. And promoted by German philosophical anarchist and LGBT activist John Henry Mackay. Is widely regarded as the first American anarchist. A four-page weekly paper he edited during 1833. The Full Revolutionist. First anarchist periodical published. Anarchist historian Eunice Minette Schuster. It is apparent that Onion anarchism was to be found in the United States at least as early as 1848 and that it was not conscious of its affinity to the individualist anarchism of Josiah Warren and Stephen Pearl Andrews. Wood presented this Proudhonian mutualism in its purest and most systematic form. Thoreau. 1817 to 1862. Important early influence in individualist anarchist thought in the United States and Europe. Author. Resistor. Dement critic. Philosopher. Being transcendentalist. He for his books Walden. Action upon simple living in natural surroundings. Essay. Disobedience. Amendment for individual resistance to civil government in moral opposition to an unjust state. Tucker fused Stirner's egoism with the economics of Warren and Proudhon in his eclectic influential publication Liberty. Influences individualist anarchism in different countries attracted a small but diverse following of bohemian artists and intellectuals. And birth control advocates. Anarchism and issues related to love and sex. Individualist naturists nudists. Anarcho-naturism. Thought and anti-clerical activists as well as young anarchist outlaws in what became known as illegalism and individual reclamation. European individualist anarchism and individualist. France. Activists included Oscar Wilde, A. Armand, Reiner, Henri Isley, Renovator, Jimenez Igualada, Brand and Lev Cherny among others. Point 3. Anarchism. Some calls for a system with common ownership of means of production and democratic control of all organizations, with any government authority or coercion. A school of thought in anarchism. Some rejects private property as a source of social inequality, attaining respect for personal property, is cooperation and mutual aid. Point 3. Collectivist Anarchism. Anarchism, referred to as revolutionary socialism or a form of such, is a revolutionary form of anarchism, associated with Mikhail Bakunin and Johann Most. Collectivists oppose all private ownership of the means of production, in advocating that ownership be collectivized. Through violent revolution, starting with a small cohesive group through acts of violence, or propaganda by the deed, would inspire the workers as a whole to revolt and forcibly collectivize the means of production. Collectivization was not to be extended to the distribution of income. Workers would be paid according to time worked, and receiving goods being distributed according to need as in Anarcho-Communism. This criticized by anarchist communists as effectively upholding the wages system. Anarchism arose contemporaneously with Marxism but opposed the Marxist dictatorship of the proletariat, the stated Marxist goal of a collectivist stateless society. Anarchist and collectivist ideas are not mutually exclusive. All collectivist anarchists advocated compensation for labor, held out the possibility of a post-revolutionary transition to a communist system of distribution according to need. Point 4. Communism. Anarchism, known as Anarcho-Communism, Libertarian communism and occasionally as free communism, is a theory of anarchism that advocates abolition of the state, property, waning respect for personal property, capitalism in favor of common ownership of the means of production, democracy and a horizontal network of voluntary associations and workers' councils with production and consumption based on the guiding principle, ability, according to his need. Anarchist communism such as insurrectionary anarchism are strongly influenced by egoism and radical individualism. Anarcho-communism is the best social system for the realization of individual freedom. Communists view anarcho-communism as a way of reconciling the opposition between the individual and society. Anarchism developed out of radical socialist currents after the French Revolution but was first formulated as such in the Italian section of the First International. The work of Peter Kropotkin took importance later as it expanded and developed pro-organizationalist and insurrectionary anti-organizationalist sections. Known examples of an anarchist communist society published around the ideas as they exist today and achieving worldwide attention and knowledge in the historical canon. Anarchist territories during the Spanish Revolution and the Free Territory during the Russian Revolution. The influence of the Spanish anarchists during the Spanish Revolution within the Spanish Civil War. In 1936 anarchist communism existed in most of Aragon, part of the Levant and Andalusia, as in the stronghold of anarchist Catalonia before being crushed by the combined forces of the regime that won the war. Spanish Communist Party repression by the USSR, as economic and armaments blockades from the capitalist countries. And public itself. Revolution, such as Nestor Makhno worked to create and defend through the Revolutionary Insurrectionary Army of Ukraine anarchist communism in the Free Territory of the Ukraine from 1919 before being conquered by the Soviet Bolsheviks in 1921. Point 5. Syndicalism. Syndicalism is a branch of anarchism that focuses on the labor movement. Syndicalists view labor unions as a potential force for revolutionary social change. Replacing capitalism and the state with a new society democratically self-managed by workers. The goals of anarcho-syndicalism are solidarity, action and workers' self-management. Anarchists believe that only direct action, that is, concentrated on directly attaining a goal, as to indirect action, selecting a representative to a government position, will allow workers to liberate themselves. Moreover, syndicalists believe that workers' organizations that struggle against the wage system. Anarcho-syndicalist theory will really form the basis of a new society, self-managing. Bosses or business agents. Workers should be able to make all the decisions that affect them themselves. Was one of the most popular voices in the anarcho-syndicalist movement. Of the origins of the movement, sought. It was important to the future of labor in his 1938 pamphlet Anarcho-Syndicalism. The International Workers' Association is an international anarcho-syndicalist federation of various labor unions from different countries. The Asociación Nacional del Trabajo played and still plays a major role in the Spanish labor movement. Important force in the Spanish Civil War. Classical schools of thought. And used to generate many philosophies and movements. Eclectic. Upon various sources. Heretic. Disparate concepts to create new philosophical approaches. And developed as a synthesis of radical feminism and anarchism that views patriarchy, domination over women, and a mental manifestation of compulsory government. By the late 19th century, writings of early feminist anarchists such as Lucy Parsons, Oldman, and Irene de Clare, radical feminists, and advocate the abolition of traditional conceptions of family, and roles. Anarchism is a school of thought within anarchism that emphasizes environmental issues. Important precedent in anarcho-naturism, and main contemporary currents are anarcho-primitivism and social ecology. Anarchism is a tendency that rejects violence in the struggle for social change. Nonviolence. Italy in the Netherlands, United States, during the Second World War. Anarchism is a movement in political theology that combines anarchism and Christianity. Influence included Leo Tolstoy, D-Day, Hennessy, Eliel. Is a tendency within the wider anarchist movement based on the organizational theories in the tradition of Dialo Truda's organizational platform of the General Union of Anarchists. Based on the experiences of Russian anarchists in the 1917 October Revolution, eventually to the victory of the Bolsheviks over the anarchists and other groups. Attempted to address and explain the anarchist movement's failures during the Russian Revolution. Anarchism is a form of anarchist organization that tries to join anarchists of different tendencies under the principles of anarchism without adjectives. Them found as its main proponents the anarcho-communists Valine and Sebastian Faure. Principle behind the anarchist federations grouped around the contemporary Global International of Anarchist Federations. Anarchy is a recent current in anarchist thought that promotes a critique of anarchism's relationship to traditional left-wing politics. Anarchists seek to escape the confines of ideology in general, also presenting a critique of organizations and morality. In work of Max Stirner and by the Marxist Situationist International, left anarchy is marked by a focus on social insurrection and a rejection of leftist social organization. Anarchism is a revolutionary theory, tendency within the anarchist movement which emphasizes insurrection within anarchist practice. Formal organizations such as labor unions and federations that are based on a political program and periodic congresses. Insurrectionary anarchists advocate informal organization and small affinity group-based organization. Anarchists put value in attack, class conflict, refusal to negotiate or compromise with class enemies. Is a theoretical move towards a synthesis of classical anarchist theory and post-structuralist thought, from diverse ideas including postmodernism, autonomist Marxism, left anarchy, stationism, and colonialism. Socialism advocates the elimination of the state in favor of individual sovereignty in a free market. Socialism developed from radical anti-state libertarianism and individualist anarchism. From Austrian school economics, of law and economics, and choice theory. current within anarchism which does not consider that anarcho-capitalism can be considered a part of the anarchist movement due to the fact that anarchism has historically been an anti-capitalist movement and for definitional reasons which see anarchism incompatible with capitalist forms. Internal issues and debates. A philosophy that embodies many diverse attitudes, tastes and schools of thought. Debate over questions of values, ideology and tactics is common. The of capitalism, nationalism, and with anarchism is widely disputed. Ism enjoys complex relationships with ideologies such as Marxism, Leninism and capitalism. And motivated by humanism, authority, and self-interest, or any number of alternative ethical doctrines. As civilization, teleology, example within anarcho-primitivism and insurrectionary anarchism, democratic process may be sharply criticized within some anarchist tendencies and simultaneously lauded in others. Novel propaganda of the deed was a tactic used by anarchists in the 19th century. Example: the nihilist movement. Contemporary anarchists espouse alternative direct action methods such as nonviolence, economics and anti-state cryptography to bring about an anarchist society. An anarchist society. Anarchists advocate a global one. Others do so by local ones. Anarchism has led to widely different use of identical terms among different anarchist traditions. It has led to many definitional concerns in anarchist theory. Of interest. Point 1. And within anarchism is free love. Advocates sometimes traced their roots back to Josiah Warren and to experimental communities. Visual freedom as a clear expression of an individual's self-ownership. Particularly stressed women's rights since most sexual laws discriminated against women. For example, laws and anti-birth control measures. The American Free Love Journal was Lucifer the Light-Bearer, edited by Moses Harman and Lois Weiss-Brooker. But so there existed Ezra Haywood and Angela Haywood's The Word. Was a major anarchist newspaper in the United States at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. The advocated free love and women's rights. Peaked Comstockery censorship of sexual information. Paris was an important American individualist anarchist who promoted free love. In Greenwich Village, both feminists and socialists advocated self-realization and pleasure for women and men. In and now. Thing with sexual roles and sexuality. Only bisexual radical Edna St. Vincent Millay and the lesbian anarchist Margaret Anderson were prominent among them. Disorganized by the villagers were frequented by Emma Goldman. Others. Noted in 1923 that Goldman has campaigned boldly and steadfastly for individual rights, especially for those deprived of their rights. That she was the first and only woman, and first and only American, to up the defense of homosexual love before the general public. Goldman. Sexual anarchist Robert Reitzel, 1849–1898, positively of homosexuality from the beginning of the 1890s in his Detroit-based German-language journal Der Arme Teufel. In anarcho-feminist Virginia Bolton published the newspaper called La Voix de la Mujer, Voice, published 9 times in Rosario between January 8, 1896 and January 1, 1897, and survived in 1901. A propagandist of free love within individualist anarchism was Émile Armand. The concept of la camaraderie amoureuse used to speak of free love as the possibility of voluntary sexual encounter between consenting adults. Consistent proponent of polyamory. Anarchists Adolf Brand and John Henry Mackay were pioneering campaigners for the acceptance of male bisexuality and homosexuality. Was an anarchist women's organization in Spain that aimed to empower working-class women. In 1936 by Lucia Sanchez Saornil, Luis Coma Posada and Amparo Poch y Gascon, and had approximately 30,000 members. The was based on the idea of a double struggle for women's liberation and social revolution, and argued that the two objectives were equally important and should be pursued in parallel. In mutual support, created networks of women anarchists. Luce Ornal was a main founder of the Spanish anarcho-feminist federation Mujeres Libres, who was open about her lesbianism. In a variety of literary journals where working under a male pen name, able to explore lesbian themes at a time when homosexuality was criminalized and subject to censorship and punishment. The anarcho-pacifist Alex Comfort gained notoriety during the sexual revolution for writing the bestseller sex manual The Joy of Sex. The Love has a dedicated treatment in the work of French anarcho-hedonist philosopher Michel Onfray in such works as Théorie du corps amoureux, Parodique solaire, 1000, Invention du plaisir, and Syrianix, 2002. Point 2. Leon Education and Free Thought. Fist William Godwin. Education was the main means by which change would be achieved. The main goal of education should be the promotion of happiness. Education had to have a respect for the child's autonomy which precluded any form of coercion, pedagogy that respected this and sought to build on the child's own motivation and initiatives, and concern about the child's capacity to resist an ideology transmitted through the school. Just as he criticizes state-sponsored schooling on account of its obvious alliance with national government. Anarchist Josiah Warren advanced alternative education experiences in the libertarian communities he established. In 1842 a long essay on education called The False Principle of Our Education is his educational principle personalist, meaning that self-understanding consists in hourly self-creation. M is to create free men and characters. B means eternal characters, who for eternal because they form themselves each moment. Its free thought was a basically anti-Christian, clerical movement. Purpose was to make the individual politically and spiritually free to decide for himself on religious matters. Attributors to liberty and publication. Prominent figures in both free thought and anarchism. Anarchist George MacDonald was a co-editor of Free Thought and Time Seeker. He's co-editor of the excellent Free Thought/Free Love journal Lucifer. The anarchists were ardent freethinkers. From free thought papers such as Lucifer, The Error, Thought and The Truth Seeker appeared in Liberty. That is a common ally of the state and as a repressive force in and of itself. In 01, an anarchist and freethinker Francesc Ferrer i Guardia established modern or progressive schools in Barcelona in defiance of an educational system controlled by the Catholic Church. The goal was to educate the working class in a rational and non-coercive setting. He clerical, believed in freedom in education, free from the authority of church and state. Note. The period 1890s was the heyday of libertarian schools and pedagogical projects in all areas of the country where anarchists exercised some degree of influence. A known effort in this field was Francisco Ferrer's Modern School, La Moderna, a project which exercised a considerable influence on Catalan education and on experimental techniques of teaching generally. Moderna, and his ideas generally, the inspiration for a series of modern schools in the United States, America and London. They started in New York City in 1911. Aired the Italian newspaper Università Popolare, in 1901. Anarchist Leo Tolstoy established a school for peasant children on his estate. Educational experiments were short-lived due to harassment by the Tsarist secret police. Established a conceptual difference between education and culture. Education is the tendency of one man to make another just like himself. Culture under restraint is free, and the teaching is forced upon the pupil, and instruction is exclusive. that only those subjects are taught which the educator regards as necessary. Fulsion. Education was transformed into culture. A libertarian tradition on education is that of unschooling and the free school, in which child-led activity replaces pedagogic approaches. Germany led to A.S. Neil founding what became Summerhill School in 1921. Often cited as an example of anarchism in practice. All Summerhill and other free schools are radically libertarian. They in principle from those of Ferrer by not advocating an overtly political class struggle approach. Organizing schools according to libertarian principles. Ets have also questioned the concept of schooling per Southeast. Schooling was popularized by Ivan Illich, argued that the school as an institution is dysfunctional for self-determined learning and serves the creation of a consumer society instead.